Going live. Welcome to the creative prompts portion of the Dark is Rising review. So, as I said, but it has some interesting things in it that I kind of liked. And I'm just going to jump into the early part right here because it's the first thing that comes to my mind is they talk about in the book here, it says, where does it say? Old ones. The main character of this discovers he's what's called an old one. My brain instantly, for number one topic, takes that to why is this like every time I read the phrase the old ones or he's an old one, I felt like, oh, so like Cthulhu or one of the elder gods in the Cthulhu mythos. And I just feel like, can you imagine like a story where the hero character grows up thinking they're a normal kid, but they are in fact a Cthulhu-like entity born to human parents, and they are a larval Cthulhu-like being. I was like, and could you make a character heroic in a way where they are oftentimes treated like a monster, but they're there to save the world from either their parents, the entities that they are companions to, other elder ones, but you could also have them save the world from some of the twisted humanity that exists out there. And so it's like every time I heard the old ones, I felt like, oh, these are baby Cthulhus in human suits. It's sort of like the Men in Black movie where they had the giant cockroach in a Edgar suit. I feel like, what if a human being was like a changeling, like in the fairy tales, the elven fairy changelings? They're elder beings stuffed into a husk that looks like a human child, and the human child is stolen away. What if you have a elder god infant swapped in place of a human baby and raised as a human? And what would it mean? I mean, like, we have like comic series like Hellboy where a demon child is raised by a human professor and becomes like a superhero. What if instead of something human like a Hellboy character, you have this eldritch horror stuffed into a human suit, thinks it's human, wants to save and protect humanity, but does so through madness-inducing weirdness. Like, I just feel like there's a story there to be told of like the good elder god. You can play it for fun, you could play it for serious. I don't know how you want to go with it, but that's the first thing that came to my mind. And then number two, as we went into the story, in the book, he's collecting a series of sigils or tokens, amulets, stuff like that. And one of the ones I thought was a really creative way to do something was when he was collecting the wooden emblem, because it's made out of wood, they had to renew it every century, I think is what they said. And I feel like in this story to have in this story where they had the way they renewed it, it wasn't just like craft another one alongside of it and then transfer the essence over or something like that. Like, they had a big piece of wood in a fire that they held a ritual around, and then they put the old one into the fire to burn, and as it burned to ash, the essence of the amulet was transferred into the large log, and as the log burned away, it burned everything but the amulet away. And so in a sense, it's very like the phoenix, where the phoenix burns its old body away, and out of the ashes is an egg from which hatches the next generation of the phoenix, or the reincarnation of the phoenix. And I thought like using that idea for the creation or the perpetuation of more fragile magic items seemed like a really neat idea. And I sort of imagine like a fantasy setting where all the implements of magic are crafted from delicate or even living things. So this idea of taking the remains of one living thing, say the bones and the skin of an animal or the body of an animal, and burning it in a fire with a magic bone sword, for instance. And as it burns away, what's left is the reincarnated bone sword. And you can have it change form slightly. So from generation to generation, where the first generation sword was like a gladius from Rome, and then the next generation sword is more like the Viking, what is it, Ulfbert? And from there you get gradually more modern and even to the point of science fiction weapons in shape, but they're all made out of the bones of the sacrificed animal. And you could even do it to a degree where this sacrificed animal might be something different. So if you took it from the early days where the sacrificed animal is a wolf or an elk, and then in modern times it might be a bison or a rhinoceros or something to that effect. And then as you go further into the future, it might be an alien creature on a distant planet that you transfer the essence of the weapon into, and you get a science fiction bone sword with the essence of the sword that's existed through the centuries in a bone that maybe is a silicon bone. It's silicon based biology on the alien world. And so I just feel like that, or doing something like a crystal key, a crystal glass key, is sort of seeing the end of its time, and you cast it into a pot of molten glass again, and as it's destroyed, it shatters and breaks down. A new key emerges when you pour off the slag or whatever. It's a little bit easier to do with things like wood or bone or things like that. But I feel like I love the idea of a world or a universe where magic items are crafted from things that were once living or in some way are consumable in fire, and they're reborn through the generations by casting them into the fire. You could do something similar for say like metals cast into salt water, where they would degrade or rust or fall away and something new emerges. But it's not quite as easy to pull off. I just like that mechanism. I really liked it. Now, number 3, you have the two main groups in this story are the darkness and the light. And you're treated through most of the story to this sentiment of it's a light versus dark conflict. But there is a moment where I sort of feel like the light is being very mysterious and very cagey about what it shares, about what it does and where they are. And we never get a vision of how the dark performs or what it does. And so I kept feeling like there's a potential story there for either once upon a time they were two halves of the same organization. And like an equivalent would be in the expanded universe for Star Wars, the Sith. the evil villain Jedi actually had their origin in the Jedi. They were Jedi who explored working on living organisms to change them and shape them using the Force, and that was seen like corruption and whatnot. And so there was this schism that formed where the Sith, the origins, the Dark Jedi, were willing to split on moral grounds from the rest of the Jedi, and there was a conflict where they were driven out, and they conquered a planet full of beings called the Sith. And when they conquered them, they took the name of Lords of the Sith. And so that's Star Wars. And I feel like there's room for something similar in this setting with that mentality. I feel like the light side of this story is, for me, the way I want to see it is, once upon a time, there were beings that used the power of the chaos and forces in the world around them to control and do things. And eventually one side, say the light side, took some of those powers, stole them from the manipulators and the dark, powerful forces at the dawn of time, and split and tried to use those forces to benefit humanity and the world. And so I kind of like the idea that the powers of the light side are in fact dark side powers that they're using in positive ways. And it suggests at that point that maybe the power isn't necessarily dark or light. It's just that there are traditions behind how to use it that lend it that consistency. And then that sort of slides over into number 4. In this story, the first huge chunk of the whole story goes over the fact that it's the light versus dark, and the dark is rising and the light has to fight it back. But then there's something suggested at a certain point, and it's just like a hint dropped here, and then like a larger hint a little bit later, and it's only really in like the last 2 chapters, I think, where we kind of get the sense that, oh wait, we've been talking about things as light and dark, that's all there is. But they do say that there is something they seek to benefit from in this story is a force of nature that is neither light or dark. They're the wild elements. It's an older thing. They refer to it as something older. And so it's like, it's the thing that came before the light and the dark picked sides. And I feel like a good story would be to have a character born to be one of the old ones on the light side, or something equivalent in a new story. But find out through the passing through this story that the light side is just as kind of heartless and manipulative in its own ways as the dark is callous and cruel. And perhaps the story to be had there is to bring people out of this light versus dark mentality and find the middle ground of just being older, wilder beings. Bring them back to the primal nature of the use of whatever essence they have around them. So I felt like that was something like the conflict between light and dark felt almost more like the conflict between 2 warring countries. You know, the Empire of Rome versus Persia, or Greece versus Persia. When the real question should be more of human beings interacting on a non-animalistic empire basis and more of a just like a wilder, freer, opener, maybe I'm slightly hippie. I don't know how you want to frame that one, but I just felt like there was room for exploring that wild magic versus the empires of light and dark. And number 5 was, there's a character in here that's called the Walker. And there's this sense of the Walker was somebody who betrayed the light for the dark, and as a consequence, he has to pay that debt back through actions and sort of a punishment, a penance that he has to carry. And I feel like I wanted to see more of a character redemption arc for that character. And I like the fact that you saw like the character was pitiful after their betrayal of the light side and sort of like a sufferer at the hands of the dark side and the light side for a long time, and then chose to openly embrace the dark side. And then there was just sort of like this sad, just like non-ending to the character. Like they came to an end, but it was just sort of like, well, that didn't go right and this didn't go right and I don't know what's going on anymore. I just don't want to do this anymore. And then they just died. I was like, that's a terrible way to do that. And I wanted to see the rise. Like I wanted to see this character who was taken from the past, the distant past of humanity, exposed to the wonders of the light, and saw in that experience some the dark within the light, the callousness or the grand agenda of the light didn't have space for something small like him. He was a thing to be used in the grander scheme because his one human life was something small in comparison to the grand scheme that they were fighting for. And so feeling used and betrayed like that, to see the temptation of a dark that promises him some power and some control, and then seeing him take that role only to later be dropped by the dark side when it's most convenient for them to not have to handle him anymore and leave them to somebody else. That too is an interesting way to look at both halves of those and really just kind of see, like, could that character come around to see, could they ever come around to see that it made sense in a long run that he as one person maybe wasn't as important as the saving of the world from the evils of the dark? Like, could he be brought around to see that? Or maybe have him, find a middle ground where he's not going to be the pawn of either the light or the dark and go for that wild side, that wilderness, older thing. I wanted to see something more of that character manifested in some way. And then number 6, this is just a fun little tack on, I think at one point. I feel like it barely had much to do with the story, and it had a pattern like a lot of the rest of the story where it sort of felt like this is sort of just retroactively thrown into the story at one point. It didn't have any real foreshadowing, and it wasn't like a deeply meaningful point in the story, but then it became this important thing for a scene that happened and then seemed to have minor consequences for the rest of the story going forward. Is a mask that was sent to the main character by his brother from overseas that is supposed to be important in the event of the resolution of this conflict for this book. It doesn't solve the whole problem of the darkness rising. It just drives away the Dark Rider. And the mask was some elaborate Wild Thing mask. It was antlered with the eyes of a bird of prey and the ears of a wolf and something like a goat or a unicorn's beard or something like that, but a human face otherwise. And I'm like, all right, so what is this? And as you go into the story, they detail how this mask it's a connection with the wilderness god, the god of the hunt, the hunter. And it has to be brought to the hunter to wake him so that he'll hunt the darkness. And that's like, okay, that's kind of an interesting idea. It makes me wonder, like, the light side has had its hands on this mask, which is the key to waking the hunter as a defender against the darkness. But the hunter is not of the light side. As near as I could tell from the story, the hunter is that older, one of those older things that's before and outside of the conflict between light and dark. So why is the light holding onto this mask of this thing that is neither light or dark a key to accessing it? I'm like, are there other masks? Does the dark have a mask for an entity that's outside of light and dark? And so I wondered, like, is it possible? Well, not is it possible, but could we write a story or stories that have masks of these old spirits that are symbiotic, that characters can find these masks and they can wear one or more, switching between the masks and access the mind, sort of like a, if you've ever watched the Star Trek Deep Space Nine series, you have the character who's Dax is a symbiote. She's a body who's a host with her own memories, and then a symbiont that's implanted that shares memories of past lives and experiences and gives insight and understanding. It's like having a second brain implanted. And in some ways, I'm also thinking along the lines of the Marvel Venom symbiont. So having like these masks that connect to forces of the wilderness and the wild, and having them sort of as objects to collect, but also to be partners that you can join with to affect some kind of middle ground against warring empires of light and dark, or however you want to frame those empires of magic. If you wanted to do something like that, I think like having a set of masks that are spirits that you can partner with in a way would be an interesting fantasy setting to work with. I think it needs a little work to understand where it's coming from and what your goal in telling those stories would be. But I'm at 23 minutes here. I'm sorry about that. That ran extra long here, but those are the ideas I got from this book. So you can see there's some interesting ideas both in this story and that can be inspired by elements of this story. So it's not a bad book. It's just really hard for me to get into. But I got a lot of fun things to explore from it. So thanks for joining me for this one. I will see you in the next video. Take care. All right.